Picture this. A heavy cavalry charge is thundering toward you. LB of horse and armored knight. Moving at 30 miles per hour, the ground shakes. You are a peasant, holding a wooden stick with a crude iron tube lashed to the end. You don't run, you wait. You light a fuse. And then, a high-pitched scream tears the air scree. A lead ball punches through the knight's breastplate like it's paper. The horse collapses. The invincible warrior is dead before he hits the mud. The weapon you just fired is called a pistula. In Czech, it means whistle. It is the great-grandfather of every firearm used today. That word traveled across borders and centuries to become the English word in your vocabulary, right? Now, pistol. This weapon didn't just kill a knight. It killed the entire Middle Ages, and the man who put it in your hands is Jan Žižka. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. History loves the young and the beautiful. Alexander the Great, Napoleon Jenschke, was neither. He enters our story as a 60-year-old wreck. One eye is already gone, gouged out years ago, leaving a flat patch of skin on his face. He is destitute, a minor noble from Tronov who spent decades as a mercenary, doing the dirty work that kings were too polite to mention. He wasn't a hero. He was a survivor who knew the ugly mathematics of a street fight. But in 1419, the Kingdom of Bohemia wasn't looking for a hero. It was looking for an executioner. The Catholic Church had just burned the reformer Jan Hus at the stake, sparking a religious rebellion that threatened to tear Europe apart. The Holy Roman Emperor, Sigismund, the Red Fox Dust, marched on Prague with the full blessing of the Pope. His mission was simple: exterminate the heretics, burn the villages, kill the men, silence the rebellion. Sigismund had the finest army in Christendom. The Hussites had farmers, women, and priests. It looked like a slaughter waiting to happen. But Žižka saw what the emperor missed. He looked at these terrified peasants and didn't see victims. He saw engineers. He saw a workforce that could turn farm wagons into mobile fortresses and threshing tools into weapons of mass destruction. The test came immediately. March 1420. The Battle of Sudom. Žižka is caught in the open. He has 400 followers, including women and children and 12 farm wagons. Charging at them are 2,000 Iron Lords, the elite royalist heavy cavalry. The odds are 5-1. The terrain is a trap. The sun is setting. By every rule of warfare, Žižka is a dead man walking. But as the Iron Lords lower their lances and spur their horses, they aren't charging into a battle. They're charging into a meat grinder. Geography dictates destiny. Žižka knew this. He stood on a narrow dam between two fish ponds. To his left lay the deep waters of Lake Marovich. To his right, the empty bed of Lake Shirati, a drained pond that looked like solid ground but was actually a deep, sucking quagmire of soft clay. He positioned his 12 wagons across the dam, creating a makeshift barricade. Then he waited. The royalist commander Balaf of Schwamberg looked at this formation and laughed. He saw a dead end. He saw peasants trapped against the water. The Iron Lords didn't bother with a strategy. They didn't scout the terrain. Why would they? They were the tanks of the 15th century. They lowered their visors, creating a narrow slit of vision, and spurred their horses forward. They aimed for the dry pond bed on the right flank, intending to sweep around the wagons and butcher the heretics from behind. The charge began with thunderous momentum. Hooves tore into the earth. But as the heavy war horses hit the bed of Lake Scardy, the ground swallowed them. The clay, deceptively firm on the surface, gave way. The momentum of the charge vanished in seconds. Horses sank to their bellies, thrashing in panic. Knights in full plate armor, weighing over 60 pounds, tumbled from their saddles into the muck, And then the trap sprang. The Hussite women had done something peculiar before the battle. They had taken off their long veils and spread them across the mud. To the knights, it looked like refuse or laundry dropped in panic. But as the dismounted knights tried to wade through the sludge, the jagged rules of their spurs snagged on the thick fabric. They tripped. They fell face first into the suffocating clay. This was the moment Žižka had engineered. The Hussites didn't fight with swords. They fought with tools. The primary weapon of the Bohemian peasant was the flail. A long wooden staff with a heavy iron club attached by a chain. For generations, they used it to thresh grain, beating the husks off the wheat. Now they threshed men. The peasants swarmed the stuck knights. They didn't aim for the gaps in the armor. They didn't need to. They swung the flails with centrifugal force, bringing the iron clubs down on the expensive German helmets. The concussive impact didn't need to penetrate the steel to kill. It shattered skulls, broke necks, and turned brains to jelly inside the helmets. The sound wasn't the sharp cling of sword on sword. It was the wet, dull crunch of metal collapsing onto bone. The Iron Lords were helpless. They couldn't stand up in the mud. They couldn't swing their long swords in the crush. They were beaten to death like cattle. By nightfall, the pride of the Catholic cavalry lay broken in the mire. Buslav of Schwaberg, the arrogant commander, was wounded and eventually captured. The survivors retreated into the darkness, leaving behind their dignity and their dead. Žižka stood amidst the carnage. He didn't celebrate. He analyzed. Sudamus proved that terrain could equalize the odds, but he knew he wouldn't always have a swamp to hide behind. He needed a way to bring the fortress with him. He looked at the blood-splattered farm wagons. They had held the line. They were sturdy. If he could reinforce them, arm them, and link them together, he could create a portable castle. He was imagining the Wagenburg. To understand how a blind man defeated an empire, we have to look at his invention. History calls it the Wagenburg, the wagon fort. But calling this machine a wagon is like calling a modern tank a car. Žižka took the standard Bohemian farm cart and militarized every inch of it. He reinforced the sides with thick oak planks, creating a ballistic shield capable of stopping crossbow bolts and early gunfire. On the bottom, he hung heavy chains to sweep the ground, preventing enemy infantry from crawling underneath to hamstring the horses. On the top, he installed retractable roofs to protect his crew from arrows raining down from the sky. But the real genius wasn't the wood. It was the crew. Each wagon wasn't just a vehicle. It was a tactical unit. A squad of 18 to 20 specialists with specific jobs. You had the driver, 2 armed pavers carrying large shields to cover the reloaders, 6 crossbowmen, 2 handgunners, 4 flailmen, and 2 pikemen. This wasn't a mob. This was an assembly line of death. Žižka drilled them until they operated like a single organism. When the enemy charged, the crossbowmen and handgunners fired in volleys. As one row fired, they stepped back to reload, while the shield bearers stepped forward to cover them. The Pashela gunners didn't aim for accuracy. They aimed for noise and chaos, spooking the enemy horses. And then there was the artillery. Žižka mounted small cannons on carts between the wagons. He called them Hufneis. The word meant crowd because that's what the cannon was designed to fire into. It was a short-barreled weapon meant for shrapnel, not siege warfare. This specific weapon, the Hufis, is the etymological ancestor of the modern howitzer. When these wagons were linked together, wheel to wheel by heavy iron chains, they formed a geometric fortress that could be set up in minutes. It solved the eternal problem of infantry: how to withstand a cavalry charge in open terrain. The knights would charge, expecting the line to break. Instead, they hit a solid wall of oak and iron. Their horses would shy away from the gunfire, forcing them to ride parallel to the wagon wall. That was the kill zone. As the knights stalled, the Hussite flailmen and pikemen would reach out from the gaps between the wagons. They hooked the riders, dragged them off their saddles, and finished them on the ground. It was brutal, efficient, and industrialized. But the Wagenburg had one more secret. It wasn't just a defensive shell. It was mobile. Žižka trained his drivers to execute complex maneuvers using flag signals. They could expand the circle to engulf an enemy unit or open the circle to let their own cavalry out for a counterattack. Imagine a tank that can dismantle itself, turn into a fortress, and then reassemble to chase you down. That is what Emperor Sigismund was marching against. But the emperor, in his arrogance, dismissed the reports. He called them mud-covered peasants. He arrived outside Prague in the summer of 1420 with a massive crusader army, estimated between 50,000 to 100,000 men. The city of Prague was in panic. The Hussite factions were arguing amongst themselves. They were outnumbered and surrounded. Their only hope lay in a strategic hill just outside the city walls. If the Crusaders took this hill, they could cut off Prague's supply lines and starve the city into submission. Žižka saw the map clearly in his mind. He took a small detachment of his tabots, only a few dozen men and women, and occupied the hill. He ordered them to dig. They built 2 small log cabins and a defensive ditch. It looked pathetic against the glistening ocean of Crusader armor gathering below. On July 14, 1420, the flower of European chivalry looked up at that hill. They saw a few dirt mounds and an old blind man waiting for them. They assumed it would be a quick skirmish before lunch. They were about to ride into one of the most embarrassing disasters in military history. The Battle of Vitkov Hill was a lesson in geometry. The hill itself was a narrow spine of the rock, steep on both sides, offering only a thin path to the summit where Žižka had dug his trenches. Sigismund had thousands of knights, but on that ridge, numbers were irrelevant. Only a few men could fight abreast. The emperor's massive army was like an ocean trying to force itself through a drinking straw. The attack was led by the elite knights of Mason. They were confident. Glistening in plate armor, shouting insults at the heretics above, they charged up the slope, expecting the peasants to flee. Instead, they ran into a wall of threshing flails and stone-hurling women. From the perspective of a knight, the world became a nightmare of claustrophobia. The path was too narrow to maneuver a horse. The slope was slippery with summer grass. As the front line stalled against Žižka's wooden palisade, the knights behind kept pushing forward, crushing their own comrades against the rocks. Žižka, despite his 60 years and failing sight, stood in the front trench. Legend says he fought with a sword in hand, guided by the sounds of the struggle, holding the line until he was nearly dragged into the enemy ranks by a grappling hook. The Crusaders were winning by inches. The sheer weight of their armor was beginning to break the wooden defenses. But then the trap snapped shut. From the city gates of Prague below, a bell began to ring. Suddenly, the southern gate threw open. A stream of reinforcements poured out. Not soldiers, but the common people of Prague. Butchers, bakers, and housewives armed with improvised weapons charged up the southern slope, screaming religious hymns. They slammed into the exposed flank of the Crusader column. Panic is a contagion. The knights at the rear, seeing a screaming mob charging them, assumed they were being surrounded by a massive army. They turned to run, but the path was blocked by their own men pushing up. The retreat turned into a stampede. Horses reared and plunged off the steep cliffs, taking their riders with them. Men in heavy armor tumbled down the rocky slopes like stones, breaking their limbs before they even hit the bottom. Emperor Sigismund watched from a distant hill as his invincible crusade evaporated. He saw his elite cavalry trample each other to death to escape a few dozen peasants. The psychological blow was devastating. The Red Fox realized that these weren't just rebels. They were zealots who fought with a ferocity that mercenaries couldn't match. Sigismund withdrew his army. He had himself crowned King of Bohemia in a hasty ceremony at the nearby St. Vitus Cathedral just to save face, and then he fled the country. The siege of Prague was broken. The victory at Vitkov Hill changed everything. It solidified Žižka's status not just as a commander, but as a holy figure. The Hussites believed God was personally directing his blade. But the war was far from over. The internal politics of the rebellion were getting bloody. While the external enemy retreated, the internal enemies, factions, greed, and theological disputes began to rise. And for Žižka, The personal darkness was about to become absolute. He had defied kings and emperors, but he couldn't defy biology. He had one eye left and fate was aiming for it. During a minor siege at the castle of Robbie in 1421, a stray arrow, or perhaps a splinter of wood from a pear tree struck by a cannonball, found its mark. It struck his remaining good eye. The infection set in. The doctors tried to save it, but the damage was irreversible. The general was now completely blind. Most commanders would have retired. How can you lead an army when you cannot see the terrain, the enemy, or even the sun? But Jan Žižka was not most men. As his vision faded into permanent blackness, his mind expanded. He was about to demonstrate something that defies belief. He would become a better general without his eyes. Blindness usually ends a soldier's career. For Žižka, it merely removed the distractions. Inside his command tent, the world was pitch black. But in his mind, it was a grid of high-definition clarity. He developed a system of command that was centuries ahead of his time. He couldn't see the battlefield. So he forced the battlefield to be translated into data. He surrounded himself with a team of trusted adjutants, his eyes. They didn't just tell him the enemy is over there. That was useless. Žižka demanded specifics. How steep is the slope in degrees? Is the mud ankle deep or knee deep? Which way is the wind blowing the smoke? Where is the sun relative to the enemy's visor? He gathered these data points and constructed a dynamic 3D map in his head. Historians compare it to a grandmaster playing blindfold chess. But with thousands of lives at stake, once the map was set, he moved his units with terrifying precision. To control an army he couldn't see, Žižka invented a language of signals that cut through the chaos of war. He couldn't rely on visual cues, so he standardized a system of flag waves. For the captains and drum beats, for the soldiers, a specific rhythm meant reload. Another meant close ranks. Another meant rotate the wagons. This necessity for order led to the creation of Žižka's military ordinance in 1423. It was the first systematic military code of conduct in Central Europe. It didn't care if you were a peasant or a noble. Everyone followed the same rules. Stealing, death; disobedience, death; breaking formation to chase loot, death. He turned a chaotic religious mob into a professional machine that operated with the synchronization of a clock. The soldiers ceased to be individuals. They became the limbs of the blind general. When he pointed a finger in the darkness of his tent, 1,000 men moved in the light. But this discipline was about to be tested against the impossible. In late 1421, Emperor Sigismund returned. He brought a new, massive army of Hungarian cavalry and German mercenaries to the town of Nahora. This wasn't a siege, it was a trap. The town of Cahora was the silver mining capital of Europe. The miners were German Catholic, and they hated the Hussites. Žižka marched his army to the city thinking he would find a defensible position. Instead, he walked into a betrayal. The German miners inside the city slaughtered the Hussite garrison and opened the gates to Sigismund's army. Simultaneously, the imperial army surrounded Žižka's camp from the outside. The blind general was trapped. He had his back to the hostile city walls, and in front of him lay the emperor's overwhelming force. He was completely encircled. No food, no reinforcements, freezing cold. Sigismund rubbed his hands in glee. He had finally cornered the blind dog. He decided not to attack immediately. He would let the cold and hunger do the work. He believed the Hussites would surrender by morning. He was wrong. Žižka wasn't planning a surrender. He was calculating the trajectory of a cannonball. While Žižka sat in his tent, a horror story was unfolding inside the city walls. The German miners of Cahora weren't just killing Hussites, they were disposing of them. They dragged captured partisans to the deep silver mine shafts. Pits plunging hundreds of feet into the earth, they threw them in alive. One shaft alone, called Kujimska, reportedly became the grave of over 1,000 people. The screams echoing up from the darkness served as a grim warning. Surrender meant a long, dark death. Outside, the temperature dropped. Sigismund's army tightened the noose. The emperor went to sleep warm and confident, believing the blind dog was finally caged. He expected a desperate negotiation in the morning. He woke up to the apocalypse. Žižka did the one thing a defensive army is never supposed to do. He attacked. But he didn't send men charging with swords. He changed the geometry of the Varenberg. Instead of a static defensive circle, he ordered the wagons to form a parallel column, a moving hallway of wood and iron. At midnight on December 21st of 1421, the Hussite army surged forward. They didn't spread out. They concentrated every ounce of firepower they had, every cannon, every handgun, every crossbow onto a single narrow point in the imperial line. It was the first instance of a mobile artillery barrage in human history. Imagine the scene. The imperial soldiers, shivering in the dark, suddenly saw a wall of fire rushing toward them. The sound was deafening. The half-nice cannons blasted shrapnel at point-blank range, carving a tunnel of meat and bone through the enemy ranks. The horses of the Hungarian cavalry panicked. The sheer volume of noise and fire created a psychological shockwave. Žižka drove his entire army right through the hole he had blasted in the enemy line. He didn't stop to fight. He drove through them. By the time Sigismund realized what was happening, the Hussites had vanished into the countryside. The emperor thought he had one. He assumed Žižka fled in terror. So Sigismund let his troops disperse to find warmth and loot the abandoned camp. He thought the war was over. 2 weeks later, the ghost returned. Žižka didn't run away to hide. He ran away to refit. He reinforced his army, turned around, and marched back at double speed. He caught the imperial army completely unprepared at the village of Nebyevidi. The hunters became the prey. Sigismund's forces, scattered and drunk on victory, collapsed. The retreat turned into a rout. As they fled across the frozen Sazava River, the ice gave way under the weight of their armor. Hundreds of knights drowned in the freezing water, pulled down by the steel that was supposed to protect them. Žižka had not just escaped a trap, he had turned it into a tomb for his enemies. Victory is dangerous. When the external enemy disappears, the internal knives come out. With Emperor Sigismund beaten back, the Hussite movement began to fracture. You had the moderates in Prague, rich merchants and nobles who just wanted to drink wine from the chalice and go back to business. And then you had the radicals in Tabor, Žižka's people, who wanted to burn the feudal system to the ground. The tension snapped. The warriors of God turned their flails against each other. But Žižka had no patience for politics. To him, discipline was binary. You were either a soldier of Christ or you were an obstacle. When a sect of Hussite extremists called the Adamites began, roaming the countryside naked, claiming they were in the Garden of Eden and practicing free love, Žižka didn't debate theology with them. He marched on their island hideout, slaughtered them, and burned the survivors. He was the revolution's immune system, ruthlessly attacking any infection, even within his own body. The nobles of Prague decided the old blind man was too dangerous to live. They formed a coalition to crush him. They knew his tactics. They knew his wagons. They thought they could beat him because they were him. They were wrong. In June 1424, at the Battle of Malashov, Žižka faced his own countrymen. The Prague coalition had a superior force, better equipment, and intimate knowledge of the Wagenburg. Žižka retreated to a high ridge overlooking a narrow valley. The Prague forces pursued, thinking the old dog was running for his life. Žižka was preparing a new surprise. He had ordered his men to fill several baggage wagons with heavy rocks. He lined them up at the very edge of the hill's crest. He waited until the Prague army was densely packed in the valley below, struggling up the slope. Then he gave the signal. The Hussites didn't fire cannons. They pushed the rock-filled wagons over the edge. These multi-ton wooden boulders roared down the hill, gathering terrifying speed. They smashed into the Prague infantry, crushing men and shattering their formation before a single shot was fired. The lines broke in panic. Before the dust settled, Žižka ordered a general charge. His cavalry and infantry swept down the hill like an avalanche. It was a massacre. The road to Kutna-Hora was littered with the bodies of Hussites killed by Hussites. Malashov was Žižka's tactical masterpiece, proving that, even against an enemy who knew his playbook. His ability to improvise was unmatched. After Milushov, no one in Bohemia dared to whisper against him. He was now the undisputed master of the land. But he wasn't satisfied with defense. He realized that to secure Bohemia, he had to make its neighbors bleed. He turned his sightless gaze outward, toward the borders of Hungary and Austria. He was done waiting for crusades to come to him. He was going to bring the apocalypse to them. By 1423, Žižka had solved the problem of survival. Now he wanted retribution. He realized that waiting for the Crusaders to invade Bohemia was a strategic error. To end the war, he had to make it too expensive for the enemy to continue. He initiated a new strategy: offensive raids into Hungary and Moravia. Historians later gave these expeditions a romantic name: Spanel, Zizdi, or the Beautiful Rides. But if you were a German villager or a Hungarian noble, there was nothing beautiful about them. They were campaigns of calculated terror. Žižka's wagons rolled across the borders, not to conquer land, but to burn resources. They struck deep into enemy territory, seized food, cattle, and gold, and left a trail of smoke behind them. The psychological impact was devastating. The mere rumor that the blind one was approaching caused entire regions to panic. Castles that had stood for centuries surrendered without firing a shot. Armies melted away before the battle began. Žižka had achieved the ultimate goal of a general. He had defeated the enemy's mind before he even engaged their body. In 1424, Žižka marched to besiege the castle of Jiboslav. He was at the height of his power. He had united the fractious Hussite armies under his command. He remained one of history's few undefeated military commanders, having fought over a dozen major battles and countless skirmishes without a single loss. He was 64 years old, blind, and seemingly immortal, but a microscopic assassin was waiting for him. While inspecting the siege lines of Jiboslav, a large, painful boil, a carbuncle appeared on his body. It was likely the plague, the Black Death that stalked every medieval army. The infection spread rapidly. The man who had survived arrows, swords, maces, and cannonballs was being eaten alive from the inside by bacteria. October died. The silence that followed must have been terrifying. The Hussites didn't just lose a general, they lost their prophet. They lost the man who had taught them that peasants could kill kings. In their grief, his soldiers did something heartbreaking. They officially renamed themselves. They were no longer just Taborites. They called themselves Sarai, the orphans. They felt abandoned by their father. But Žižka had left them one final instruction. It was a command so grotesque, so heavy with heavy metal symbolism that it blurred the line between history and myth. He allegedly ordered that his skin be flayed from his body and stretched over a giant drum. He wanted to continue leading the charge. He wanted his enemies to hear his voice, the boom of the drum, and tremble even from beyond the grave. August 14th, 1431. 7 years have passed since Žižka's death. The Pope has declared a fifth crusade. This time, they are certain of victory. The blind sorcerer is rotting in the ground. The Hussites are leaderless orphans. A massive imperial army led by Cardinal Julian Cesaurine, over 100,000 strong, crosses the Bohemian border near the town of Douglas. They are confident. They are numerous. They are loud. But as they enter the deep Bohemian forests, a strange sound begins to drift through the trees. It isn't the clash of steel. It isn't the roar of cannons. It is singing. Thousands of voices synchronized in deep, chanting a low, menacing melody. It is the Hussite battle hymn. The Hu are warriors of God and of his law. To the superstitious minds of the German knights, this wasn't just a song. It was an incantation. As the hymn grew louder, it was joined by a rhythmic, mechanical rumbling. The earth began to shake. It was the sound of hundreds of iron-bound wagons rolling over the hard ground. Thump, thump, thump. And then the panic set in. Legend says that the Crusaders didn't even see the Hussite army. They just heard the sound. In their minds, the ghost of Jan Žižka had risen from hell to lead the charge. The myth of the skin drum played into their deepest fears. The idea that the blind general was beating the rhythm of their death. A collective psychosis swept through the imperial ranks. Seasoned knights, men who had fought in dozens of battles, began to sweat. The cardinal tried to rally them, but it was useless. The terror was contagious. Before a single arrow was loosed, before a single lance was lowered, the entire crusade disintegrated. 100,000 men turned and ran. They dropped their weapons, their armor, and their banners. They trampled each other in a desperate bid to escape the invisible monster approaching. Through the trees, Cardinal Cassari himself had to disguise himself as a common soldier to escape, leaving behind his hat, his crucifix, and the papal bull authorizing the crusade. The Hussites arrived to find an empty battlefield littered with enough gold, supplies, and weapons to fund their war for another decade. They didn't have to fight. The memory of Žižka had fought for them. This event at Damagus is unique in military history. It was a victory won entirely by reputation. Žižka had traumatized the European psyche so deeply that his name alone was a weapon of mass destruction. The orphans chased the fleeing crusaders all the way to the border, hacking down the stragglers, proving that while the father was dead, his children were very much alive, and they were unforgiving. The Catholic Church finally realized that the Hussites could not be defeated by force. The invention of the Wagenburg, the pisteller, and the psychological terror of the blind general had changed the rules of the game forever. For the first time, the Church was forced to do something it hated: negotiate. The Hussite Wars eventually ended, not with a bang, but with a signature. In 1436, the Catholic Church, exhausted and humiliated, signed the Compacts of Basel for the first time in history. The Church officially negotiated with heretics. They granted the Bohemians the right to receive communion in their own way. It was a victory won by the iron will of a man who had been dead for 12 years. Jan Žižka left behind more than just a peace treaty. He left a blueprint for the future of violence. Look at a modern main battle tank. It is heavily armored, carries a large cannon, and uses machine guns to suppress infantry. It is in essence a mechanized Virenberg. Žižka was the first to realize that firepower needs mobility and protection to be decisive. He didn't just invent a tactic. He invented the concept of armored warfare. And then there is the word itself. Every time a police officer draws a pistol, they are paying linguistic tribute to the Czech pishtala, the whistling pipes that Žižka's peasants used to shatter the age of chivalry. He took the gunpowder that the Chinese use for fireworks and the Europeans use for siege engines, and he put it into the hands of the common man. He democratized death. Today, if you visit Prague, you can climb Vitkov Hill. Standing there, overlooking the city he saved, is a colossal bronze statue of Jan Žižka. It is the third largest bronze equestrian statue in the world. He sits on his horse, mace in hand, staring out over the capital with eyes that cannot see, yet seeing more than any king of his time. Žižka's story is a terrifying but inspiring reminder of the power of asymmetry. He proved that an army of amateurs armed with conviction and cheap technology can dismantle an empire of professionals. He showed us that constraints, even blindness, are not barriers. They are catalysts for innovation. He didn't fight the way war should be fought. He fought the way it needed to be fought to survive. He remains the only commander in history to fight fully blind and never lose a battle. He was the undefeated, the Oneid, the ghost of Bohemia. If you enjoyed this journey into the brutal origins of modern warfare, please like this video. It helps the algorithm find other history lovers like us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dive into the forgotten figures who shaped our world, and let me know in the comments. Do you think Žižka was a hero of the people or a fanatical tyrant? I read every comment, and I'd love to hear your perspective. Until next time, keep looking for the truth in the shadows of Yi.